can see this throughout the history of the far right and the extreme right, is a language about presenting oneself being a victim and facing attack, and therefore being justified in taking some quite hardline and extreme responses to that.
Police will join forces to stop summer of riots, vows Stam, and will develop that theme and now because he said he's going to introduce a new capability across police forces to combat the violent disorder that we've seen in parts of England in the past few days. At a Downing Street press conference, the PM said fear is an understandable reaction to the attacks and called on the public to give families the space to grieve and authorities time to do their job. Let's speak to Professor of the History of Radicalism and Extremism at the University of Northampton, Paul Jackson. Professor, hello and good evening to you.
Hi, good evening.
Hi. We've had the Prime Minister's operational response to the recent disorder, this capability unit. But what about the deeper forces that lurk beneath? How would you characterise them? Because some commentators have got very, very angry when they've been called far right. They say they're ordinary, decent British patriots who are fed up of seeing youths running around with knives, people stabbing children, people coming across in boats. But you take the long view in this. How would you characterise what we've seen?
Well, I think one of the things that, in a way that kind of speaks to, and as you can see this throughout the history of the far right and the extreme right, is a language about presenting oneself being a victim and facing attack, and therefore being justified in taking some quite hardline and extreme responses to that. So with these most recent protests, I think how you've seen the kind of the far right operate is by, again, explaining and justifying itself through this language of Britain is facing a threat, we are under attack, and therefore this is a legitimate response. And I think that's something that probably needs to be challenged.
Yeah.
As I say, that emotive sense of victimhood, I think, is something that's quite core to the far right's politics.
Yeah, I mean, back in the day, when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, they were very, very clear. If you're white, you're all right. If you're brown, stick around. If you're black, get back. That's what people used to say, okay? And much, much worse. These days, they might even have people of colour among their ranks. You see people marching alongside Tommy Robinson, who might be of Sikh background or some of African Caribbean. What do you make of the way in which they're morphing, how they're trying to present themselves? They claim not to be racist, just patriot these days.
Well, again, I think that's something that's quite problematic. And even if you kind of go back into the 80s, the National Front also engaged to a degree with people like Colonel Gaddafi. And you can go back further and see other examples where white nationalist groups see some commonality with groups with other kind of quite extreme views as well. So some of those sort of qualities aren't exactly new either. So, as I say, I think what we kind of need to think about here is the ways in which something is being exploited for political gain. And I think that's what you can see throughout the history of the far right.
And when you look at those who are exploiting they used to be found on the streets. Some are now pointing the finger at those who find themselves elected as politicians in the Houses of Parliament, saying, oh, we're not being told everything, or the police need to be commended if they beat up an Asian person in Manchester Airport. What do you make of that? How big a gap is there between some of the elected politicians and some of the people who are out on the street saying, oh, Tommy Robinson? Do you see what I'm saying?
I think the common thread is a sense of undermining trust. And I think what we can kind of see from some political voices from various parties has been a kind of a questioning of trust in various ways in aspects of the legal system, aspects of the ways in dealing with issues such as immigration. And you can find that sort of same core language expressed perhaps in different ways within these more sort of violent street protest situations. One of the kind of the terms that kind of crops up a lot in far right studies amongst academics is the term mainstreaming. And again, this isn't a particularly new thing, but it's where more mainstream, more respectable kind of figures articulate some of the messages, but perhaps not all of the tenor in all its dimensions of the far and extreme right for their own political gain. And I think, again, that's something that we need to be perhaps more worried about than protests themselves, because there you're seeing a real purchase of more extreme political views into places where it can exert greater political influence.
Mm.
As I say, I do think that's quite a dangerous thing that we're seeing in recent times.
Yeah, well, we've seen that manifesting itself in the behaviour and some of the language adopted by senior figures in the Conservative Party, some of whom held very high office indeed. How much further might things go, and how much pressure are senior Labour figures, including the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, to try to draw the sting from this by being much tougher on migration, much tougher in policing, and trying to sweep the rug from under the feet of some of those enablers.
Yeah, I think the challenge is a different one than rather than sort of aping a language of toughness and hardness in those sorts of ways, because that's playing into that trap of mainstreaming, which only makes the problem bigger in the long run. I think the bigger challenge, especially for Labour right at the moment, is to try and find ways to change the debate and change the tenor of discussion around immigration in the medium to long term, to bring down that heat around this particular issue. And I think the last government was certainly kind of increasing the heat around that issue, and other parties such as Reform have also been playing quite a significant part in that dynamic as well. So simply aping some of these kind of tough stances doesn't necessarily address the issue. It just, in a way, kind of further cements a sense of distrust that particular systems, say the immigration system, are working effectively. And if people don't have trust, then they do turn to political alternatives, and that's where the far right can capitalize.
Yeah.
So as I say, I think the issue here is about changing the debate.
Okay. I wonder how we do that. Paul Jackson, Professor of the History of Radicalism and Extremism at the University of Northampton, thank you very much indeed. And we'll talk about that in more detail later on with the security specialist Chris Phillips and the commentator Rhea Freeman. It's Henry Bonsu on Times Radio, 18 minutes past 10.